We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Shaun Scott. Shaun Scott is a local historian, film producer, and director. His films include Waste of Time, American Capitalism, Consumption, and The Quest for Renewal. 100% Off, a recession-era romance, which is his latest film and still in production. And he is here to talk about his first film, Seat of Empire, Seattle since 1909. So start out, tell us, what was your motivation in creating your film, Seat of Empire?
Seat of Empire was the first project that I've had the fortune to work on as a filmmaker based in Seattle. I started production on it in 2008 upon graduating from the University of Washington with a degree in history. So my motivation really came from a couple of things. One, personal, and I guess maybe the other slightly more intellectual. Personally, I was really taken aback when I was still in school by how sort of Seattle's film scene was coming into its own. And you had a lot of very interesting filmmakers who were doing very interesting things with representing the region, with representing the people who live here, the kinds of lifestyles that you find here. So they could be films like Police Beat or films like Immaculate Conception. Later on, films like My Effortless Brilliance. All of these films and projects by other filmmakers, and I had the sense getting out of school as somebody who was used to communicating himself with the medium of film in the history department, that I had something to contribute as well and something to add to this conversation that was taking place between people who were, I don't want to say my peers because many were much older, but people who I looked up to and people whose work I respected, definitely wanting to feel like I could be a part of that conversation and hold my own in it as well. So I think that's the first motivation. The second, intellectually, or more broadly, when the film was made, when Seat of Empire was made, it was in 2008, production carried into 2009, and at that time the city was sort of in the middle of putting on centennial celebrations for what was called the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Expedition of 1909, effectively a World's Fair that was held 100 years ago, where Seattle as a city was able to announce itself and put itself kind of on the map after a few critical events that had taken place in the 1890s. Boom of single-family houses that was tied to the gold rush, the city being sort of reconstructing itself after a great fire that took place in the 1880s. All of those things in the 20 years leading up to 1909 led to that great World's Fair, which was then in turn celebrated by the city in 2008, 2009. So I wanted to find a way, frankly, to lass up the party a little bit, because I knew that what was going to happen was that we were going to be talking maybe in terms of very grand stories that were quite pallid and quite hoary and quite tried, but didn't really get to the heart of the matter about how did this city really get to the place that it is at today. So that was really the main thing for me, and coming from a very I'd say critical perspective, partially because of the interest that I had in school, and then also just because kind of person who I was growing up was always feeling like there was something behind, what was being purported or what was being presented. So I think Seat of Empire was kind of my opportunity to get behind the mask or behind the persona a little bit and see what sort of institutional vectors and practices and malpractices led to Seattle being the city that we see has so much international renown and respect today.
Well, I have to say, I really enjoyed watching your film, if for no other reason, because it clearly wasn't something that I think the Chamber of Commerce ever would have produced. It's kind of like the hidden history of Seattle in a way.
Well, one thing I do have to say is that the Seattle Mayor's Office of Arts and Cultural Affairs was generous in the support that they gave in the production of the film, and I had sort of filled out for a grant in 2008. Thank goodness I got it, otherwise I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about the film. You can have all sorts of great ideas, but it doesn't count if it doesn't get made. So finding the institutional support for it was very important, and I think it say what you will about Seattle as a city, but it says something about it says something that I was able to find the institutional support for something that, at face value for a lot of people, probably didn't seem like the most, most cheery or most upbeat story. But for me, I think you were asking about motivations a second ago. I think that if you have I don't remember who it was that said, I think it was James Baldwin, that if you love your country, that is exactly why you reserve the right to criticize. I think I feel the same way about the city as a whole, that for me, the truest expression that you could get of your devotion to a person or a place or a thing is to really scrutinize, break it apart, see how it works, see if it can't do better than what it's doing currently. So,
all right. So a half hour is not going to be enough time to cover all that you touch on in the film, clearly. But maybe you could start out and talk a little bit about the city founders and the significance of war and the natives in early Seattle history.
Sure. Half an hour might not be enough, but the film itself was 2.5, 3 hours long. So I think I've gotten a little bit used to trying to condense, 160 years of history into a few sound bites. So here we go. Let's see if we can't do it. I think one of the first things that one would have to understand about the city's origins is that it was founded mostly by people who came from other parts of the country. Okay, a place this far west. Many of the original founders, we're talking about people who were members of what was called the Denny Party. So Henry Yesler, through Denny, Doc Maynard, folks like those came, if not from very elite backgrounds on the East Coast. Many of them had roots to sort of the Department of War and what its sort of operations and goings-on were in the 1840s and 1850s. So many of these men were people who had, they were men who were able to get a great deal of social prestige and some degree of wealth through military operations that the Department of War was in charge of back then. And them being members of the Department of War, many of them were sort of stationed. The main object of the Department of War up through comparatively recently, actually, was managing the frontier, which was code for wiping Indians off of it, okay? Managing relations with Native Americans and ultimately whether those relations were peaceably, like for much of the time in Seattle they were, or whether they were explicitly warlike, as they often were in sort of the Midwestern towns. The object ultimately was going to be the marginalization and gradual disenfranchisement of Native Americans. I think that story is a national one in the same way that it's always been a local one here, in that Native Americans, we're talking about tribes like the Duwamish or the Suquamish, Lashai, all of those tribes, even until today, and especially in the 1850s when the city was founded, were very integral in all kinds of ways to the city's economy. If you were finding land to build homes, you're probably going to be doing it using the knowledge that natives had of the lay of the land. If you were going to be drinking, you were probably going to be doing it with hops that were found and manufactured by sort of natives who were already here. If you were going to be oftentimes starting a family, you were going to be doing it. There were going to be white men and native women who were carrying on with one another. So from the very beginning, the sort of the relationship between the two groups was always a very complicated and institutionally intertwined one. That gradually started to fall apart, I think, for some reasons that we could get into a little bit. But for me, the long and short of it is that as natives started to get, the reality of the situation started to set in a little bit more. You found some tribes that were more militant, maybe, than the Duwamish or the Suquamish. And they started to eventually push back a little bit. And sometimes that pushback involved strategic attacks, violence. The force in return that was meted out with federal support. And so you would have troops that were stationed here with the help and the support of the federal government. That was the infamous Battle of Seattle of 1856. I think that was the first time that the city and its fortunes, both from an existential perspective, but then also a financial one, started to be tied a little bit to what went on with the military and what went on with sort of the use of force as a way to incur prosperity. And that is a trend, as I'm sure you know from watching the film, from watching Seat of Empire, something that stays consistent for the next 155, 160 years of the city's history. Okay, so we could be talking about that particular example is pulled from the 1850s. Later on, when there were ethnic cleansing campaigns that were waged against the Chinese, for example, a similar story. Federal troops coming in to mete out physical force to solve, sort of on-the-ground disputes between the two ethnic groups, but those troops staying well past the actual event itself. So coming here in February of 1888, but not leaving until July or August of that same year. Right on down to World War I, the city is sort of experiencing a slowdown in the boom of its economy that had come about through the construction of a lot of houses. There was a series of recessions that took place in the early 20th century. World War I, in much the same way that World War II did, pulled the city sort of out of economic turmoil and made it so that questions that it had about its long-term viability, it was able to put those off for a little while longer because of the boon of military spending that came here in the guise of massive shipyards, large military bases, things of that sort. And that you can continue this on. This is a persistent trend, and it's a persistent theme in the film. In Seat of Empire was looking at how sort of larger and global territorial squabbles were quite beneficial to the city financially. And I'm sure you probably have. I see you have a list of questions there, so we'll probably get into that. A little bit more of those details.
It's fascinating. I think you point out there's like five major times.
It's, if you can think of, maybe a better way to do it than counting forward is we can go backwards just as well. We know that, for example, a lot of what the city is known for, sort of the place that it has in the dot-com boom or internet technology, a lot of that stuff wouldn't be possible if it weren't for military spending that took place in order to develop the technology that eventually became the internet. Okay, so on a macro level, that's sort of the case. All throughout the 90s and still into the 21st century, you see sort of this dance that had started off arguably and most prominently with Henry Jackson and Warren Magnuson in the 50s and 60s. But still today with our representatives, we see sort of this devotion to making sure that certain federal contracts for federal projects, among them military projects, the aft fuselage for the F-22 is the example that leaps to mind immediately. Projects that are purported to be, the pretense is that we need them to fight certain territorial wars abroad, certain geopolitical projects that need to take place. But oftentimes those projects, for example, the F-22, the production of those projects far exceeds, in many cases, the actual practical use of any of them. If you're talking about a company like Boeing as well, what you would often find, and this is again starting the 1950s and continuing on today, that you would have sort of milestone contractual agreements that were built into the production of an F-22 or of a certain carrier that made it so that the longer the project took to build was actually the more lucrative the project took to get. There's the main source that I'm thinking of here is How to Control the Military by John Kenneth Galbraith. So you see this interesting paradox where at the same time that we're often told or be led to believe that certain wars or conflicts are urgent and they can't wait. We can't, if we wait another day, the Soviets or the terrorists or the Chinese or the natives or whoever it happens to be that year are gonna creep up on this, and we need these weapons. At the same time that's being said out of one side of the mouth, out of the other side of the mouth, or with the other hand, I should probably say, companies that take longer and longer and longer to build, the weapons we need to fight a lot of these conflicts are privileged for doing exactly that. So it's a like I said, a persistent theme that comes across in the film, and I think for me was probably seeing how that worked, and I had always had a sense that was sort of the case just through courses that I took in school, but I think seeing with my own two eyes and seeing how that worked, dollar for dollar, year for year, era for era, representative for representative, war for war, and county for county was very eye-opening.
One of the preeminent local military contractors, Boeing, features fairly large in your film.
It does. I think one thing I always want to make clear is that the capacity and this is speaking personally from one filmmaker's perspective, I have a tremendous capacity for wonder for some of the things that many of the companies that are based here have been able to accomplish over the years. I mean, one of my favorite films is The Aviator, right? So that's a pretty short, straight line when you're looking at the life of Howard Hughes and what it took to get a company like TWA off the ground, literally off the ground. It's a pretty short, straight line from that to understanding that you're not dealing with people who were short-sighted necessarily when you're talking about the Boeing Corporation. And obviously many people who I've known personally who've had family members or who themselves have worked at the corporation, very clean, decent, conscious, socially aware people who have worked for the company. So I think it's for me, it's kind of an idea that, okay, so if you can get that much, then why is it that on the other hand, so much of the corporations' politics internally seem to be often so short-sighted and seem to operate without sort of the greater good in mind. And I'm thinking about sort of what President Eisenhower in 1961 dubbed the military-industrial complex that we were just speaking of is sort of one example of it. The Boeing company also has sort of a darker, earlier history in the 20s and 30s with the fact that Althea Boeing was one of the largest real estate holders in the city at the time. Most cities, or most sort of subdivisions or suburbs in the city were racially segregated as well. So the fact that the wealth of the company being tied to two sources or two tributaries that were very, very questionable, to say the very, very least. One, residential segregation, and then also sort of the company's sort of ties to the military spending. I think, I often struggle, I think, in the film to bring forth the fact that all of those things do not make or break a company or a city, but they're conversations that have to be brought up if we're going to have facts that have to be brought up if we're going to have a serious conversation about where the city has come from since 1909.
One of the themes that you continue to challenge in the film is the city's integration or lack thereof of different groups. For instance, Scandinavians are always featured prominently in Seattle history.
Right.
You point out the Filipinos, who have contributed just as much, are put in a completely different tier than Scandinavians. Right.
There's a middle section of the film that is sort of a comparative ethnography of natives, Scandinavians, and Filipinos, just as you say. And sort of looking at them as three groups that were definitely constituted at one point in time as distinct ethnic groups. And the irony of it being that through one way or another, it could be the hard way if you're talking about the native and Filipino populations, or it could be a line that was a little bit straighter and shorter for Scandinavian folks, owing to ideas that we had in this country about race, standards of beauty that we had for certain phenotypes, and really, really twisted and ultimately backwards ideas about which groups to which we were going to extend certain privileges. All of those groups, one way or another, extended an indelible influence on the city's landscape and character. And so I think that that for me is the real part of the story that's actually very inspiring, is that even with, you're talking about a Filipino population, for example, that for much of its time here was, as I said, residentially segregated, forced to live in one portion of the city, they still were able to be at the forefront of labor politics in the 30s and 40s, so that many coalitions of black folks, Filipinos, working class whites came out of sort of movements that Filipinos had spearheaded in the canneries and shipyards here. So it's on the one hand, you're talking about groups that are marginalized at every step of the way, but that too, I think, is part of the story as well. So I think we're some other people might be of the opinion that necessitates a much more sort of militant stance. And if we were outsiders from the beginning, then we're outsiders forever. I think that it's important to keep in mind the fact that all of these groups that had at one point in time been outsiders or another, they had managed to have a mark on the city that can't be denied.
Can you touch on the role that expositions played in the city of Seattle?
Sure. There have been many. I mean, the AYPE, the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, sort of was the first of a series of really self-congratulatory municipal celebrations that the city has sort of held for itself over the course of the 20th century. So starting with 1909, then you have other affairs like the Potlatch in 1911, Seafair that came about in the late 1940s, Street Fair. Even something like WTO was intended to be yet another one of these sort of strain of, self-congratulatory Seattle announcing itself, on the global stage kinds of things. And of course, that one went horribly wrong, but it still belonged to horribly wrong, at least from the perspective of the people who thought it was going to be, an uncontroversial celebration like some of those other ones were. But I think rather than taking a lot of those things at face value, I think that the more mature way to go about it is to really use those as opportunities to have conversations that we often don't, or to think in sort of more critical ways that we tend not to about what exactly this place is. So when we look at a celebration like Street Fair, for example, that takes place every May in the University District, it's not really part of the conversation so much that the original intention of that celebration was so that it was sort of, you mentioned the Chamber of Commerce earlier, it was sort of a coalition between the Chamber itself and many local businesses in the University District. How can we get people to not think, how can we not get a lot of students out in the streets to protest the Vietnam War and maybe get them out there to, buy snow cones and that sort of thing? It was, very much a diversionary sort of, and maybe, I think the case could be made that some of those that sort of diversionary mindset is still very present today in a lot of those celebrations. But that's sort of where I see it. I think those parties for me those municipal celebrations for me are more interesting for what they say, often for what they don't say rather than for what they present. Yeah.
But even those, as brought up in your film, Seat of Empire, integrated the military into those festivals. Right.
Yeah, I mean, something like, I think a more sort of a more current example that would be thinking about sort of the place that WTO was originally supposed to have and it's starting off as something that was supposed to be, Philadelphia, which is probably one of the only other cities in the country that has a labor and blue collar tradition as entrenched as Seattle's. They eventually turned it down. So what part of the backstory to that was that there were sort of national captains of finance who were looking for a place to put this thing, and when one blue collar city turned it down, they somehow picked the place that had a 20th century steeped in anti-corporate politics going all the way back to the general strike, if not before. So seeing how those that sort of celebration that was intended for one thing activated something completely different, I think was really interesting to see from a historical perspective.
We are talking with Shaun Scott. He is a local historian, film producer, and director, and talking about his film Seat of Empire, Seattle since 1909. And just a few minutes left, but you are going to be showing your film, at least part of your film, coming up here pretty soon on November 12th at the Grand Illusion Cinema.
Right. The Grand Illusion Cinema is sort of one of many local film institutions that is and has been for a long time immensely supportive of the local film community here. So I sort of talked with them about the prospect of having an event there on the 12th or the 13th. Significance of the date being that it was on November 13th actually that the first whites had traveled to the Puget Sound region and made contact with the natives here, and eventually started the city that we know today as Seattle. There had been other contact before, but it was that particular fatal landing on the 13th of November in 1851 that really set in motion sort of the events that led to the founding of the city. So I thought it would be appropriate 160 years later to have some sort of a screening that would hopefully start a conversation at Grand Illusion Cinema and beyond about sort of the origins of the city, where it's been, where it's going. So that's November the 12th, which is a Saturday at Grand Illusion, and that's open to the public. All
right. One of the many things you touch on in the film is some of the city founders, those that we have named streets after, and Mercer Street. I didn't remember until seeing your film. Asa Mercer had interesting history. Can you just briefly touch upon that?
Yeah. Well, Asa Mercer as a character, I think probably the most, when it really comes down to it, the thing that people know him most for is the fact that Seattle, maybe even more so than it is now, was quite a bachelor town, like many Wild West towns were in the 19th century. So, sort of city fathers, Asa Mercer among them, had often had conversations about how can we remedy this. I mean, a lot of the, we're not going to go out and endorse something like intermarriage between whites and natives, and then on top of that, a lot of the women who were here were, by their standards, not respectable, to say nothing about, sort of their own attitudes and ideas that made sort of Seattle's extensive network of whorehouses and brothels a very real reality. And something that was very evident for anybody who traveled here. They quickly came to the conclusion that the way to solve sort of the problem was to go back east and sort of establish what we would know today as something like resembling a mail order bride system. Okay, so these were the women who they went back and brought from places in Massachusetts were called the Mercer Girls, famously. So it's another one of these examples of people cruising down Mercer Street wouldn't know that just a few, first they wouldn't know the backstory of kind of the act that the person who the street was named after is most famous for, and also wouldn't know that, not too far from there at some point in time, the city had such a bawdy and gaudy reputation that there was a company that purchased land there for the expressed purpose of building what was dubbed very unapologetically the world's largest brothel, right? So this is really a lot of the backstory, things that I was very interested in from a cinematic perspective. I think these kinds of stories, when they get told about a place that presents itself with a very clean cut image on the one hand. These are sort of the things that, this is how the sausage was made, put it one way.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Hey, thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks for having me.